the summer of 1943 in Texas, when American soldiers and German prisoners of war decided to throw secret barbecue parties together. And before you think I've lost my mind, this actually happened. Right here on American soil during the height of World War II, while young men were dying on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, their enemies were sitting in the backyard of a Texas farm, sharing ribs and cold beer with the very people who were supposed to be guarding them. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This is documented history that got buried because nobody wanted to talk about what really went on in those POW camps scattered across rural America. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the strangest chapters of the Second World War, something that happened far from the beaches of Normandy and the ruins of Berlin. We're talking about forbidden friendships, illegal gatherings, and the kind of human connections that weren't supposed to exist between enemies. And when I say illegal, I mean these men were risking court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and serious prison time just to sit down and eat barbecue together. But they did it anyway, again and again, throughout the war years. Now most of you remember World War II from history books or maybe from your parents' stories. You know about Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the Holocaust. But here's what they didn't teach us in school. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war right here on American soil. Not in Europe, not overseas, right here. Texas alone had dozens of POW camps, some holding thousands of men. And the thing is, most Americans today have no idea this even happened. These weren't concentration camps or brutal prison facilities like you might imagine. We're talking about camps in small Texas towns where German soldiers lived in barracks, worked on farms, and walked around with a surprising amount of freedom. See, America had signed the Geneva Convention, which meant we had to treat POWs humanely. They got 3 meals a day, medical care, recreation time, even got paid 80 cents a day for their labor. Meanwhile, American families back home were rationing butter and sugar, watching their sons ship off to fight these very same men. Can you imagine the tension, the confusion? Here you had Texas farmers whose boys were fighting Germans in Europe, and now they had Germans working their fields, picking their cotton, harvesting their crops, because that's what happened. America had a massive labor shortage. All our young men were overseas fighting and somebody had to bring in the harvest. So the government made a deal. German POWs would work American farms under guard, help with the labor, and everyone would follow the rules. Except that's not exactly how it played out. The first camp I want to tell you about was near a little town called Mexia, Texas. Mexia population back then was maybe 6,000 people, mostly farmers, ranchers, regular folks trying to survive the war years. In 1943, the government built a POW camp just outside town. Suddenly, Mexia had over 3,000 German prisoners living right there. 3,000. That's half the town's population. These weren't SS fanatics or hardcore Nazis. Most of them were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, conscripts who'd been captured in North Africa or Italy. Farm boys themselves, many of them. Teenagers, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Scared kids who spoke broken English and just wanted to survive until they could go home. The guards were mostly older American soldiers, men who were too old for combat duty or who'd been wounded and sent stateside. And here's where it gets interesting. These guards, they weren't career military. They were civilians in uniform, local boys, National Guard types, and they were guarding men who in another life could have been their neighbors. Both groups were far from the real war. Both groups were bored out of their minds in rural Texas. Both groups were homesick. It started small. A German prisoner named Wilhelm working on a farm outside Mexia, he knew how to fix engines. The farmer's tractor broke down during harvest season, and the American guard, a kid named Bobby from Houston, he watched Wilhelm take that engine apart and put it back together in an afternoon. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood machinery. Bobby offered Wilhelm a cigarette. Wilhelm took it. That was the first crack in the wall. Within weeks, Wilhelm was eating lunch with the farmer's family. The guard looked the other way. Why? because Bobby's own brother was somewhere in France, and he'd heard stories about how German civilians had shared food with American POWs. There was this unspoken understanding. If we treat their boys right, maybe someone over there will treat our boys right too. It was hope disguised as disobedience. But the barbecues, those came later, and they started with a man named Karl-Heinz Schmidt. Karl was 24 years old, captured at El Alamein in North Africa. Before the war, he'd been a butcher's apprentice in Bavaria. He knew meat, understood it. When he got assigned to work at a cattle ranch near Hearne, another Texas town, the ranch owner, a man named Jack Morrison, he noticed Karl knew his way around livestock. Jack was short-handed, his son was in the Navy, and he needed help. Real help. Jack started trusting Karl with more responsibility, let him work with less supervision. And Karl, he wasn't stupid. He knew this was better than sitting in a camp. He worked hard, never caused trouble, and slowly Jack stopped seeing him as a prisoner. He started seeing him as a worker. Then something shifted. It was August 1944. Brutally hot. Jack was having a family barbecue, just him and his wife and a couple of neighbors. The guard who was supposed to be watching Karl, a fellow named Tommy, he was sitting under a tree trying not to melt. Jack looked at Karl standing there by the fence, sweating in the sun, and something in him couldn't take it anymore. He walked over with a plate of brisket and beans, handed it to Karl through the fence. Tommy saw it happen and pretended he didn't. That was the moment. That single plate of food changed everything because Karl damn near cried. He told Jack, through broken English and hand gestures, that he hadn't tasted real food like that since before the war. It reminded him of home, of his father's butcher shop, of Sunday dinners with his family. And Jack, tough old Texas rancher that he was, he felt it too. That recognition that this enemy was just a kid who missed his mother's cooking. The next week, Jack invited Karl to sit at the table with them. Not through the fence, at the table. Tommy the guard, he should have reported it immediately. Court-martial offense, no question. But Tommy was from a small town in East Texas, and his daddy had taught him that you don't let a man go hungry when there's food on the table. So Tommy sat down too, kept his rifle next to his chair, and they all ate together. Jack's wife Helen, she served Karl like he was any other ranch hand. And that became their Saturday ritual. Every Saturday evening, barbecue. Karl, Tommy, Jack's family, sometimes a neighbor or two who were in on the secret. Word spread the way secrets do in small towns. But here's the thing about rural Texas during the war. These communities were tight. Everyone knew everyone, and they all had the same problem. Too much work, not enough hands, and a complicated relationship with these German prisoners who were just trying to get through each day. So when Karl Hoffman, another farmer 10 miles away, heard about Jack's Saturday barbecues, he didn't report it. He started his own. By the fall of 1944, there were at least a dozen farms across 3 counties where American families and German POWs were sharing meals. Not every weekend, not everyone, but enough. Enough that it became this open secret that nobody talked about publicly. The prisoners would finish their work detail, and instead of loading straight back into the trucks to return to camp, they'd linger. Half an hour here, an hour there. The guards would radio in late returns, blame it on equipment trouble or roads or weather. And during that time, men who were supposed to be enemies would sit together and eat. They talked as best they could. The Germans who spoke English would translate. They talked about their families, their farms, their lives before the war. American guards showed pictures of their girlfriends and wives. German prisoners showed letters from home, talked about their villages and parents. And what they found was terrifying in its simplicity. They weren't different. Farm kid from Iowa and farm kid from Saxony. They had the same calloused hands, the same tired eyes, the same dreams of going home. There was a prisoner named Joseph who played accordion. Someone convinced him to bring it to one of these gatherings. He played German folk songs, and then one of the Americans had a guitar, and they figured out they could play together even if they didn't know the same songs. Music doesn't need translation. There are photographs that survived, hidden in attics and shoeboxes for 80 years. Blurry images of men in different uniforms sitting together, smiling. Evidence of something that wasn't supposed to happen. Now you're probably wondering about the politics of it all. These were Nazis, right? Well, not exactly. That's the complicated part. Some of these prisoners were true believers, sure. Hitler fanatics who caused trouble in the camps intimidated other prisoners, held secret Nazi meetings. Those men weren't getting invited to barbecues. But the majority, especially the ones captured later in the war, they were done with it, exhausted, disillusioned. They'd seen their friends die for a cause they'd stopped believing in, if they ever believed at all. They knew Germany was losing. The Americans knew it too. So these gatherings had this strange end-of-the-war feeling, like everyone was just waiting for it to be over. But it was still dangerous. In early 1945, a captain from Army intelligence got wind that something irregular was happening at camps in central Texas. He started investigating, interviewing guards, checking logs. Several guards were questioned. A couple were reassigned. The barbecues stopped for a while, went deeper underground. Because if this got out officially, if it went up the chain of command, people were going to prison. This wasn't some minor infraction. This was fraternization with enemy prisoners during wartime. This was treason adjacent in the eyes of the military. The guards and farmers involved, they knew the risks, but they kept doing it anyway. Why? I think it's because once you share a meal with someone, once you learn their story and see their humanity, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to treating them as nothing but an enemy. That's what war tries to make us do. It tries to turn people into categories, into us and them, into good and evil. But barbecue doesn't care about politics. Breaking bread together, or in this case breaking brisket, that's one of the oldest human traditions. It says you're part of my circle now. You're under my protection. We're in this together. There was an incident in spring of 1945 that could have ended everything. A German prisoner named Ernst got seriously ill, appendicitis. The camp medical facilities were basic, and the nearest hospital was in Waco, over an hour away. The camp commandant refused to authorize transport because Ernst was, quote, not critical enough. But the guard assigned to Ernst's work detail, a sergeant named Pete Rodriguez from San Antonio, he'd been eating with Ernst at these secret gatherings for months. He knew Ernst's family back in Germany, knew his little sister had died in an air raid, knew Ernst was terrified of dying far from home. Pete made a decision that could have cost him everything. He commandeered a truck, put Ernst in it, and drove him to the hospital himself without authorization. He told the hospital staff he was acting on orders, forged some paperwork, and got Ernst into surgery. Ernst survived. Pete was almost court-martialed when the camp commandant found out, but Ernst's American work supervisor, the farmer who'd employed him, he wrote a letter to the base commander praising Pete's quick thinking and suggesting that saving a POW's life should be commended, not punished. The investigation was quietly dropped. That story got around. The prisoners heard about it. They realized that some of these American guards actually cared whether they lived or died, and that changed the whole dynamic. There was more trust, more openness. More guards started looking the other way when prisoners got a little extra food, a little extra time, a few small comforts. The line between guard and guarded got blurrier. After the war ended in May 1945, you'd think everything would change. But it didn't, not immediately. The prisoners stayed in American camps for months, sometimes over a year. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. There was nowhere to send them back to, not safely. So they stayed in Texas, kept working the farms, and those relationships that had formed, they continued. Some of them got even stronger because now the war was over. The tension was gone. Nobody was shooting at anybody. It was just a waiting game until repatriation could be organized. The barbecues became more frequent, more open. Whole communities started including the German prisoners in local events. There's a story from a town called Rosenberg where the prisoners helped rebuild a church that had burned down. When the church had its rededication ceremony, the German prisoners were invited. They sat in the pews with American families. They sang hymns in German while Americans sang in English, same melodies, different words. Can you imagine that? Former enemies worshiping together in a small Texas church. The war over, everyone just trying to find some kind of peace. When the prisoners finally started going home in late 1945 and through 1946, there were tearful goodbyes. Americans and Germans who'd spent years together, who'd become friends despite everything, they didn't know if they'd ever see each other again. Some of them exchanged addresses, promised to write, and some of them did. For decades afterward, letters crossed the Atlantic between Texas farmers and German former POWs. Christmas cards, birth announcements, photos of grandchildren. A few prisoners never went home. They liked Texas better than war-torn Germany. They applied for immigration, married American women, became American citizens. There's a cemetery in Hearn where a German POW is buried next to the American farmer who employed him. Both died in the 1980s, old men by then, but they'd stayed friends for 40 years after the war. The farmer's son told a reporter that those two men shared a bond nobody else understood. They'd lived through something together that couldn't be explained to people who weren't there. But here's what haunts me about this story. For decades, nobody talked about it publicly. The men who participated, they kept it quiet. Some took the secret to their graves. Why? Because even after the war, even after everyone came home, there was shame attached to it. Shame that they'd befriended the enemy. Shame that they'd violated military protocol. Shame that they'd shown compassion when they were supposed to maintain discipline. American veterans came home from horrific combat experiences, and how were they supposed to feel knowing that some guards back home were having barbecues with German prisoners? It was complicated, messy, didn't fit the clean narrative of good versus evil. The family stayed quiet too. The farmers, the neighbors, the people who knew. They understood what could have happened to their loved ones if this had been officially discovered during wartime. So they protected the story, kept it private, only told their children and grandchildren in hushed conversations decades later. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that historians started piecing it together from old letters, forgotten photos, interviews with the last surviving witnesses. What those historians found was remarkable. They found evidence that these kinds of interactions happened all over America, not just Texas. POW camps in Kansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, New Mexico, even up north in Michigan and Wisconsin. Wherever you had rural camps with farm work details, you had guards and prisoners forming human connections. The barbecues might have been a Texas thing, but the fraternization was widespread. It was an open secret across the entire American POW system. And here's what the military knew but never admitted. They knew it was happening and chose not to crack down too hard because the program was working. The prisoners were productive, cooperative. Escape attempts were rare. Violence was minimal. The camps ran smoothly. If building some rapport between guards and prisoners kept everything peaceful, the higher-ups were willing to look the other way as long as it didn't become a public scandal. Plausible deniability. Don't ask, don't tell. Decades before that phrase meant something else. Think about what this means. In the middle of the most destructive war in human history, with millions dying, with genocide happening in Europe, with cities being bombed to rubble, there were these small pockets of humanity. These moments where people refused to be enemies, where they chose connection over hatred. It didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't save lives on the battlefield, but it saved something else. It saved the humanity of the people involved. Those American guards who shared their food, who talked with their prisoners, who saw them as people, they came out of the war different than soldiers who'd only known combat. They had a more complicated understanding of what war does and who fights it. They knew that most soldiers aren't monsters. Most are just scared kids doing what they're told, hoping to survive. That's a hard truth, but an important one. And those German prisoners who experienced American kindness, who were treated with dignity even though they'd fought for an evil regime, they went home with a different view of America. They told their children and grandchildren that Americans weren't the propaganda monsters they'd been taught about. They were people, good people, who showed mercy when they could have shown cruelty. That matters. That seeds of goodwill planted in wartime, they grew into something bigger during the Cold War and beyond. There's a man named Peter Schmidt, son of that prisoner Carl who started attending Jack Morrison's barbecues. Peter lives in Munich today. He's in his 70s. His father told him about Texas before he died. Peter visited here in 2003, found Jack Morrison's grandson still living on the family ranch. They met, shared a meal, barbecue naturally. Peter brought photos his father had kept, pictures from those forbidden gatherings in 1944. Jack's grandson had heard the stories from his grandfather but had never seen proof. Those two men, connected by something their ancestors did 80 years ago, they wept together looking at those photos. This is why these stories matter. Not because they change the big picture of World War II. Not because they erase the evil that was done or minimize the sacrifice that was required to defeat fascism. They matter because they remind us that even in the darkest times, people can choose compassion. They can choose to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies to be destroyed. That choice is always available, even when institutions and governments and propaganda machines are screaming at us to hate. The barbecues between Texans and German POWs, they were illegal. They were against regulations, against protocol, against everything the military said was proper conduct. But they were profoundly moral. They were an assertion that some things are bigger than war, that hospitality, kindness, human dignity, these aren't luxuries you can only afford in peacetime. These are necessities that keep us human even when everything around us is trying to make us into something less. I think about those men sitting together in a Texas backyard, the smell of mesquite smoke in the air, sharing a meal they all could have gotten in serious trouble for. I think about what it took for them to do that. The courage, not the battlefield kind but the quiet kind. The courage to disobey orders that seemed wrong, to risk your career and freedom because your conscience said this is right. That's heroism too. A different kind than we usually celebrate, but heroism nonetheless. The last verified barbecue between American guards and German POWs happened in September 1946, just before the final group of prisoners shipped out from Camp Hearn. Over 100 people attended, Americans and Germans together, a farewell celebration that lasted all afternoon and into the evening. Local police knew about it, base command probably knew about it, but everyone looked the other way one last time. There were speeches, toasts, promises to remember. Some of those men kept those promises. Letters crossed the ocean for decades. A few reunited in their old age. Most never saw each other again but carried the memory forever. What do we do with a story like this? How does it fit into our understanding of that era? I think it complicates things in a necessary way. It reminds us that history isn't simple, that war isn't simple, that people aren't simple. The same country that fought a righteous war against Nazi Germany also showed mercy and kindness to captured German soldiers. Both things are true. Both things matter. We can honor the veterans who stormed the beaches and fought in the snow and died in the mud, while also acknowledging that some veterans and soldiers and guards chose a different kind of courage by refusing to dehumanize their enemy. The men who participated in these barbecues, most are gone now. The youngest would be approaching 100 years old. Soon there will be no one left who remembers firsthand. But we have their letters, their photos, their stories told to children and grandchildren. We have the evidence that this happened, that in the midst of global warfare, a group of Americans and Germans decided that eating together mattered more than following rules designed to keep them apart. So the next time you fire up a grill, the next time you sit down to eat with friends and family, remember that food has power. Sharing a meal has power. It breaks down walls. It builds bridges. It turns strangers into neighbors and enemies into friends. Those Texas farmers and German prisoners discovered that in 1943, sitting in a backyard while the world burned around them. They knew they were breaking rules, but they also knew they were doing something deeply right. They were refusing to let war steal their humanity. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that war is simple or that all soldiers are good or bad, but that we always have choices. We can always choose to see the person instead of the uniform, the human instead of the enemy. It won't stop wars from happening. It won't solve the big problems, but it might save us from becoming monsters ourselves. It might let us come through the darkness with our souls intact. Those illegal barbecue parties between Texans and German POWs, they weren't grand gestures. They didn't change the course of history, but they changed the lives of everyone who participated. They proved that even in wartime, even when ordered to keep distance and maintain discipline, people will reach out to each other if given half a chance. They'll share what they have. They'll show kindness. They'll remember that before we're soldiers or prisoners or Americans or Germans, we're human beings who all want the same basic things: safety, dignity, connection, maybe some decent barbecue and a cold drink on a hot summer day. Sometimes the simplest acts of rebellion are the most profound.